I spent most of my life waiting. Not for something specific. Not for someone to arrive. Just waiting. 10 seconds into this confession, here is the truth I never said out loud: I believed my real life hadn't started yet. And I acted accordingly. I treated the present like a temporary condition. Something to endure until everything aligned. Until I felt ready. Until circumstances improved. Until I became the version of myself who was finally allowed to live fully. I assumed that version was coming. So I waited. I waited to feel confident enough to take risks. I waited to feel complete enough to deserve happiness. I waited for clarity before making decisions that actually mattered. In the meantime, I lived carefully. Conservatively. I did what was expected of someone in my position. I met responsibilities. I avoided disasters. I told myself I was being patient. Patience sounded noble. Waiting sounded harmless. No one warns you that waiting can become a lifestyle. I didn't think of myself as passive. I was busy. My days were full. I woke up early, completed tasks, handled obligations. From the outside, my life looked active. Inside, it felt provisional. I kept telling myself this wasn't the final version. That the real chapter would start later, once I figured things out. Once I felt different. Once something clicked. I didn't notice how dangerous that belief was. Because when you believe your life hasn't started yet, you don't treat it with urgency. You don't invest fully. You don't risk much. You don't ask the questions that could change everything. You just manage time. I postponed decisions that felt heavy. Relationships that demanded presence. Choices that would lock me into a direction. I told myself I was staying flexible. In reality, I was staying unavailable. I noticed how often I said things like "not yet" and "someday" and "I'll see how things go." Those phrases became my shield. They allowed me to avoid committing, not just to plans, but to myself. I believed commitment would make things real. And I wasn't ready for real yet. Years passed quietly that way. Not wasted, just suspended. I marked time by age, not experience. Birthdays arrived and left without meaning. Seasons changed, but nothing inside me shifted with them. I didn't feel young. I felt unfinished. I watched others build lives that seemed solid, imperfect, lived in. They struggled, failed, adapted, transformed. Their stories had texture. Mine felt like a draft. I told myself I was being cautious. That I didn't want to rush into a life I might regret. That waiting was smarter than choosing prematurely. But waiting never gave me answers. It only delayed questions. Late at night, alone, I felt a quiet anxiety I couldn't explain. A sense that time was passing without my permission. That moments were leaving without being experienced. I tried to reassure myself. Everyone feels like this sometimes. Life unfolds slowly. You'll know when it starts. But deep down, a doubt had begun to form. What if this was my life already? What if there was no clear beginning coming? The idea unsettled me, so I pushed it away. I told myself I still had time. That I was just in a transition phase. I didn't realize how long I had been transitioning. I was waiting for my life to begin. And I didn't yet understand that it already had, quietly, without asking whether I was ready. The moment I began to suspect that my life had already started, I didn't want to believe it. Because that realization carried weight. If this was my life already, then waiting hadn't been neutral. It hadn't been preparation. It had been a decision, repeated daily, quietly, without resistance. And that meant I was responsible for the emptiness I kept feeling. That thought frightened me more than any uncertainty ever had. I started noticing how often I delayed things not because I couldn't act, but because acting would force me to accept consequences. Commitment terrified me more than failure. Failure implied movement. Commitment implied permanence. As long as I waited, everything remained reversible. I could still become someone else. I could still choose differently. I could still claim I hadn't really begun yet. Waiting preserved possibility. At least, that's what I told myself. But possibility without action slowly decays into illusion. I began to feel it in my body, a low, constant tension that no rest could dissolve. Days felt busy but strangely hollow. Weeks passed without distinction. I struggled to remember what I had actually lived versus what I had simply gotten through. I wasn't unhappy. I was suspended. That suspension started to feel unbearable once I noticed how much of my identity depended on not yet. I wasn't unsuccessful, I was still figuring things out. I wasn't alone, I was not ready for something serious. I wasn't directionless, I was keeping my options open. Those explanations protected me. They also kept me invisible. I realized I had built my life around avoiding finality. I didn't want to be defined by a choice because definition felt like limitation. I believed keeping everything open meant staying free. What it actually meant was never arriving anywhere. The fear intensified when I saw how other people related to time. They spoke about chapters, not transitions. About phases that ended, not periods that lingered indefinitely. Even their mistakes felt intentional in hindsight, things they had done rather than things that had happened to them. My life felt like something that was happening around me. I had become an observer of my own existence, convinced that participation would come later. The breaking point came in a way I didn't expect. I was asked to talk about my life, not casually, but honestly. To describe where I was, what mattered to me, what I was moving toward. As I spoke, I realized how vague everything sounded. I talked about plans without timelines. Goals without urgency. Desires without commitment. I sounded like someone waiting for permission. And no one was going to give it to me. That realization hurt deeply. Because it meant there was no external barrier holding me back. No missing piece I needed to find. No signal I was waiting for. The waiting itself was the barrier. I felt a surge of grief, not dramatic, but heavy. Grief for the time I had treated as rehearsal. For the moments I had diluted because I didn't believe they counted yet. For the courage I had postponed until some imaginary future version of myself arrived. I began to understand something painfully clear. There is no moment when life officially begins. There is only the moment you stop postponing it. Waiting hadn't protected me from regret. It had created it. I could feel myself approaching a choice I had avoided for years, not a specific decision, but a fundamental shift. A decision to stop treating my life like a draft and accept that every day I delayed was shaping the final version anyway. That terrified me. Because once you stop waiting, you can no longer pretend you didn't know better. And I knew. I just hadn't wanted to admit it yet. The moment I stopped waiting didn't feel heroic. It felt terrifying. Because once I accepted that my life had already begun, there was no longer a safe place to stand outside of it. No before. No rehearsal. No future version of myself who would handle things better. There was only me, now. And I wasn't ready. That was the lie I had been living inside for years. The belief that readiness would arrive before responsibility. That clarity would come before commitment. That confidence would precede action. None of that happened. What arrived instead was a simple, uncomfortable truth. Waiting had never been about preparation. It had been about avoidance. I had avoided choosing because choice would make my life real. It would give shape to things I had kept conveniently undefined. It would expose me to regret, not the abstract regret of, what if, but the concrete regret of, I chose this. Waiting allowed me to avoid that weight. But it also allowed my life to pass unclaimed. Once I saw that clearly, I couldn't go back to pretending. Every day I continued to wait felt like an active decision to disappear a little more. The safety of postponement began to feel more dangerous than any mistake I might make by acting. So I stopped waiting. Not in a dramatic way. I didn't overhaul my life overnight. I didn't suddenly know what I wanted or where I was going. I simply stopped treating uncertainty as a reason to pause. I made decisions without guarantees. I spoke honestly without rehearsing the outcome. I allowed myself to want things before I felt deserving of them. I committed to paths knowing they might be imperfect, knowing I might regret parts of them later. That regret no longer scared me. Because regret meant I had lived. The fear shifted. It wasn't about choosing wrong anymore. It was about choosing nothing. Life became heavier once I stopped waiting. Days mattered more. Time felt sharper. I could no longer hide behind the comfort of later. Each moment asked something of me: attention, presence, responsibility. That weight was exhausting. It was also grounding. I began to feel connected to my own existence in a way I never had before. Even difficult days felt real. Even uncertainty felt earned. My life stopped feeling like a placeholder and started feeling like a story I was actively writing, even when I didn't like the direction. I learned something I wish I had known earlier. There is no signal that tells you it's time to start living. No internal switch flips. No perfect alignment arrives. Life begins the moment you stop asking whether it's allowed to. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, if you feel like you're still waiting for your life to begin, hear this gently. You are not behind. But you are not early either. The waiting you call patience might be fear in disguise. The flexibility you protect might be avoidance. And the future you keep planning for might never arrive the way you imagine it. I spent years waiting for my life to begin. When I finally realized it already had, I didn't feel relief. I felt responsibility. And strangely, that responsibility felt like freedom. I don't know how my life will turn out. But I know this. I would rather live imperfectly now than wait forever for a version of myself that never comes. I stopped waiting. And for the first time, my life didn't feel like it was about to begin. It felt like it was finally happening.